So imagine that you're on the Via Dolorosa, on the way of the cross, and imagine the sights, the smells, the sounds, the horror, what you see, and imagine that you're at the cross and how the gore, the sadness, the sorrow. Put yourself in that position if you can. Of course, it's impossible. I mean, to say that we can try, that's the best we can do. And the other thing to keep in mind is in the Old Testament, now these are just a few of the passages, but if another one of Bishop Barron's comments is if you read the Old Testament is a foretelling of God's salvific plan. So if you go to these passages and others, by the way, if you're interested, leave your email address with me. All of the passages that are going to be cited on this PowerPoint, there's about a 3-page handout that has them all listed and spelled out there. But pay attention to that, and also keep in mind this. The Old Testament, there is a common theme throughout the Old Testament that applies to this and to us today. In the Old Testament, the phrase you usually hear is the law and the prophets. Okay, the law and the prophets. We have Abel, we have Melchizedek, we have Abraham and Isaac, just a few. But the most important thing in this mosaic is not the 4 humans, the sacrificial lamb. Keep an eye on the sacrificial lamb. Melchizedek, the high priest job, sacrifice the animals for atonement. Animals, typically if it's a lamb, a ewe, a ram, cut their throat, hang them upside down till they bleed out, till their blood is completely out. And you read the Old Testament, rivers of blood on high holy days coming out of the side of the temple. Abel sacrifices his lamb, Cain sacrifices his lamb. God prefers Abel's sacrifice. You know the rest of the story. And Abraham and Isaac, instead of sacrificing Isaac, he finds the ram in the thicket. But keep the lamb in your mind. All right, we're going to focus on an 18-hour period. My opinion, and I don't think it's disputable, the most important 18-hour period in the history of mankind. We're going from about 9 o'clock on a Thursday night to 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. And as far as what Jesus went through, obviously there's no separation between the divine and the human. But human enough, and his statements in the Gospels are very clear. Was he emotionally stressed? Yes. Take this cup away from me. What did he feel spiritual torment? Yes. Was he abandoned? Oh my gosh, these guys just hit out of town with him. Not only Judas betrays him, Peter denies him right in front of him and takes off. And in the garden, once he's taken into custody, the quote is, the apostles all flee. Everybody hits the road. They're out of there. So talk about being completely alone. No sleep from assuming he got up at daybreak on Thursday morning, didn't sleep until he died. And the beatings, at least 3, probably 4 separate assaults before the scourging took place. And before even picking up his cross, walking more than 2.5 miles. And if you look at the setting that he's in, the upper room and the Last Supper, generally at that time, it's estimated the population of Jerusalem was about 40,000, maybe 50,000, something like that. But on holy days, high holy days, and this is Passover time, you've got 250,000 people, up to 250,000 people that are inside a city that is 4 miles, in a walled city that's 4 miles in circumference. So when you go down, by the way, don't go through Davenport on the way out of here today. The parade starts at 11:30. But you go down there and imagine that 10 times over. Okay, that is a very packed and very loud, smelly. All the devout Jews around frankly, the known world at that time are trying to get to Jerusalem for the Passover. So Christ and his disciples are in the upper room, the cenacle, on Mount Zion for the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, the description of it in the Gospels it's clear that the disciples really don't understand clearly what's happening. Where is this? What are we doing? Why are you doing this? What are you talking about? That I'll be back in 3 days. Is the only one who really understood all this was Judas. I don't think he understood the theological, the spiritual, the eternal part of it. Judas knew what he was doing. We all know the rest of that story as well. And I'm sure you're familiar with Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. And if you look at other works from, probably from any time, most of the time you find Judas at one end of the table or the other, or Judas is in the doorway at the edge of the image. This is one of the few times, and I think Da Vinci did this on purpose. He puts Judas right here. And there are three things, and one of them's hard to see, well, two of them are hard to see, but three things that are notable about this. One, he's got a leather pouch in his hand. Now, Judas was the treasurer for the disciples, but I think it's reasonable to expect, are these the 30 pieces of silver? Secondly, it's difficult to see. There's a little container of salt that's tipped over next to Judas. And at that point in time, betrayal of the salt. You know, the term salt of the earth, okay? Keeping the flavor, keeping the season. And the third thing is Judas's head is on a horizontal plane lower than anybody else's head. And Da Vinci probably did that on purpose because he was not elevated the way the rest of the disciples were. So now we go from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, this would have been about 9 o'clock Thursday night. And at that time of year, early April in Palestine, in Jerusalem, 9 o'clock at night would have been temperature about mid, maybe upper 50s or so. And it's about a 1 mile walk, and there will be a map here in a moment. I'll show you where the direction they took, kind of a curly-Q approach to it, but out through the wall of the city, through the Kidron Valley, up the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus, as you know, wait here. I'm going to go up there and pray to what's known as the Rock of the Agony, which is now part of the Church of All Nations on the Mount. And in the Garden of Gethsemane is derived from, it is an olive grove. It's derived from the Hebrew gachmanim. Gachmanim meaning oil press. So the olives are harvested, they're pressed for olive oil. But through the Old Testament particularly, as well as in the Gospels, as well as in the New Testament, the symbol for the Holy Spirit is oil. And you can make a relation to a connection from this to a passage in the 34th Psalm that the Spirit of God was crushed. That psalm relates to, it's one of the psalms that is very, very, it's a lamentation type of psalm. So the Spirit of God crushed in the garden. At one point of, not really trivia, but related to this, we're all familiar in the Sorrowful Mysteries with the agony in the garden. And in the King James Version of the Bible and in ones that I've looked at, other ones used more commonly today, this is the only time the word agony is used in the entirety of the Bible. And if you think back to when the Bible was first assembled and first transcribed, it was in Greek. And the Greek word agonia means great fear, terror, anxiety. So this is the only, and not trivial, it's only in Luke's Gospel. And this is where Luke comes into play. He's the patron saint of physicians. Luke was not only a physician, he was a perfectionist. He would have been a great investigative journalist because he interviewed everybody he could. He made sure he had the stuff right. He was a painter, quite artistic, but he was detail-oriented. So he would use the appropriate terminology. And that brings up this topic, hematohydrosis, sweating blood. It is not a metaphor. It is a thing. It is a real thing. My good friend Tom McGovern's a dermatologist in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Tom and I share the same interest, also known as hematohydrosis, or in the Greek thrombohematos, meaning clotted blood. But what it is, there is blood that is released through sweat glands and hair follicles. And it is only in Luke's Gospel. And since 2004, there are at least 20 cases in the dermatology literature of confirmed cases. Confirmed meaning photography and biopsy. Doing a skin biopsy to see, yes, there is blood that is pooling at the base of the hair follicles within the sweat glands, and it exudes from there. And the common factor in all of those reported cases is high-level emotional stress. So this is not metaphor. We're all familiar with this, Judas's betrayal. It's one of the few episodes that is common to all four Gospels. And the importance of it obviously cannot be underestimated. Without Judas, the story would not be the same. You're well familiar with that. So Christ is taken into custody, and he's probably assaulted, probably beaten up on the way to the home of Annas. Now, Annas used to be the chief priest, used to be the high priest for the temple in Jerusalem. It's not clear why he wasn't at this point in time. He either stepped down or he was kicked out of office, whatever happened. But we'll come to a minute why he was taken to Annas first, because he still has more of a patriarchal impact on this. But Annas' home is about 0.8 of a mile from the Garden of Gethsemane. And what we've done so far, here's the upper room, the cenacle on the Mount of Olives. Jesus and the disciples go east, directly south, out through a gate in the southeastern wall, through the valley, up the Mount of Olives. Here's the garden. He's taken into custody. He's brought back along through an eastern gate, all the way over to what it says Caiaphas' residence. Caiaphas was Annas' son-in-law. And they were either living in the same residence or adjacent to each other. So there's a certain amount of nepotism here that takes place as well. And it's the first place, we're not sure what happened to Christ while he's being taken to Annas, but clearly in John's Gospel, the guards that are with Annas and have brought Jesus there, they're not happy with how he's answering the questions. So we know that he was assaulted in Annas' home. He's taken next door or down the hallway to Caiaphas. And again, he is mocked. He is taunted. He's still held captive. It's hard to see in the projection, but on the far right of that picture, just the look of the laugh, that diabolical smile on the guard. And this is where the first charge of blasphemy is leveled. And we'll come back to why that was, we all know that was not appropriate, that was not accurate, but I'll show you in a moment why that was even illegal. There's these trivial little arguments. When you get into a very isolated study like this, there are some authors that like to nitpick, I would say. Was he slapped? Was he punched? What was it? Well, if you go back to the original Greek transcription, rapisma means slapped, kolaphizo means struck. They're both in there. Open hand, closed fist. We can readily, I think, generally assume that it was both. There is some tradition and not a lot of evidence that while he was at the home of Caiaphas, that he was lowered into a pit under the home. There is a mosaic in an ancient church in Jerusalem that shows what looks to be Christ, and he's standing in a rather dome-like room, and he's got a harness around his chest with a rope that goes up. And some of the traditional stories is that he was lowered into that, and that's where he was beat up while he was at the home of Caiaphas. No proof of that, but this is at the same site as what is now known as St. Peter in Gallicantu Church. And Gallicantu is the Latin word for cock's crow. So this is the same location where Peter denied Jesus, denied knowing Jesus. And a little bit of interesting trivia, and if you want to call it ironic, that would be appropriate. This box was found 25 years ago at a road construction site near the Old City in Jerusalem. And it's very ornate, so you knew whatever's in there, it was important. And this box is called an ossuary. And an ossuary is a box, literally a box of bones. And what you can't see on this image is on the side here, the word Caiaphas is written. And it was very close to what is felt to be the home of Caiaphas. So is this, whether or not these are the bones of Caiaphas, can't prove it, but the history seems to support that. So he's done with Caiaphas. It's the middle of the night. He's taken before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, he's going to have two appearances in front of them. This one, it's really a trial. But what I want you to remember is not the fact that it's a trial or that the Sanhedrin is a civil or political assembly. This is a trial at night. We'll come back to that. Once again, he's blasphemous. That's the charge that's leveled. And it's documented that this is the episode where he is blindfolded and somebody punches him, slaps him, hits him, and says, now prophesy. Who hit you? If you're a prophet, you should be able to tell me who it was. Then he's taken at daybreak to a second trial before the Sanhedrin inside the temple in what's known as the Chamber of Hewn Stones. And there are 71 members. In the chamber, the members are made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. And very similar to the House of Representatives or the Senate. You've got 35 on one side, 35 on the other. The high priest up here, the accused, is standing there. And this is the assembly that ultimately is overwhelmingly they want Jesus gone. This is the man who's claiming he's God. He's at least blasphemous. If not, he's making the Romans mad. Not all of them were in it. This was not unanimous. In fact, if you look at today's gospel, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. And Nicodemus was the one who stood up and said, aren't we going to let him defend himself? He has no defense. And we'll come back to that as well. And more or less, got the high priest, but then in our terms, it'd be like the Speaker of the House and the minority leader, the Nasai and the Av Beit Din. Those were the two leaders just below the high priest. Now, I keep teasing about this illegal aspects. Okay, there are several points, and what you have to understand is you go back to the Jewish law, and we all know the Jewish law was very strict, the rituals, the traditions, but if you go back particularly to Deuteronomy and Leviticus, the items that all of the tenets of the Jewish law that were violated for this 18 hours, they're numerous. First off, no trials in the high priest's palace. Trials only in the chamber of hewn stones. Number two, no trials the night before a Sabbath, on feast days, or at night. Number three, if you were guilty, the guilty verdict was only pronounced the day after the trial. He's guilty, not even allowed to be proven innocent. And Deuteronomy in two passages clearly states, you have to have two or more witnesses corroborating the same story. There were people testifying, but they all had different stories. So that violated that tenet of the Jewish law. No arrests at night. The Sanhedrin could investigate charges, but not instigate them. His charges started when he saw Caiaphas, and only continued. They changed the charges. That is not legal according to Jewish traditional law, from blasphemy to treason. What I mentioned before, the incident with Nicodemus, he was not permitted a defense. They are required by Jewish law to have a defense, and the Sanhedrin is not allowed to pronounce death sentence as an assembly. A death sentence was not allowed to be pronounced. Now, I'm going to give them a little benefit of the doubt on this. I don't want to. When we get to Pontius Pilate, the death sentence was, I would just say they were accessories to what Pilate allowed. So they take him to the Romans, and he goes before Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea. And Pilate, he's a Roman, he's an official, And his job's on the line. And if you're a Roman official way out in the boondocks, if your job's on the line, your life's on the line. If Caesar's not happy with what you're doing, if he's got a riot on his hand, he doesn't have to worry about procurator. He's not going to be alive anymore. And so they bring Jesus to Pilate with this charge of blasphemy. Pilate doesn't care. Blasphemy is not a political problem. Blasphemy is a religious problem. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees see this. They understand this. They say, whoa, well, wait a minute now. This is the guy that says he's the king of the Jews. And he's telling the Jews, don't give tribute to Caesar. Now he's got Pilate's attention. Now Pilate is saying, okay, so if this guy's seditious and treasonous, this is something I better pay attention to. I do not want a riot on my hands. But maybe I'm too charitable, but I'll give Pilate a little benefit of the doubt too. He's thinking, how can I get out of this predicament? And he finds out that Jesus is a Galilean. He says, wait a minute. Herod Antipas, across town. He's the tetrarch for Judea. You go see him. You're his problem, not my problem. And Herod is excited. He hears Jesus is coming. He's not met him before, and he's thinking, this is the guy that brings the dead back to life. This is the guy that the lame walk and the deaf hear and the blind see, and I can't wait to meet this guy. And ultimately, it was, in Herod's opinion, it was overpromise, underdeliver. He didn't get what he wanted from Jesus. He wanted a miracle. He wanted to see something happen. It didn't. So he's going to send him back to Pilate. However, if there's anything good about this vignette, there's no indication that Christ was mistreated, assaulted, while he was with Herod. So he goes back to Pilate. Now we've taken a long hike. We've gone from Caiaphas. We've gone through the city to the temple. We've gone to Pilate in the fortress of Antonia, right next to the temple. We take a trip back. This is Herod, and then back up again to the fortress. And so he was probably beaten when he was returned, either on the way back to see Pilate or before seeing Pilate again. There are some old manuscripts that talk about him being caned or staved. Now, caning, you see the long canes, bamboo canes, whatever, used for scourging. Those were commonly used. The Romans also used staves. And what I mean by that, you look at the way a barrel is assembled. All the staves, the vertical boards that are held with the metal band around it, those are being beaten with a stave from a barrel. And it's essentially the same as getting beat up with a 1x4. You got a piece of wood that you're being assaulted with, which is nothing compared to what happened at the scourging. This is at the fortress of Antonia and on the north side of the temple. And what is felt to be most likely is this would be the floor of what the fortress looked like at that time in today's world. And now it's known as the lithostratos, for stone pavement. And the reason it's relatively accepted conventional wisdom that this was the floor of the fortress is that on the floor there are these markings, and these are markings for what we would call board games. These were games of chance that the Roman soldiers, they would carve the pattern into the rock, into the stone, and in their downtime they would play these games. This is their version of graffiti. And the Roman protocol for scourging, the Romans were exact. The Romans had hundreds of years to perfect everything they did, from their law to their administrative duties to their organizational chart. They were very exact. And scourging is recorded back, the Etruscans, which is current day Tuscany, Italy, there were 800 years of information that the Romans had to base their scourging on. And it was routinely, if you had a death sentence, you weren't getting off easy right away. You were going to be scourged before you were executed. But it was not done on women, on Roman senators, or on soldiers, with one glaring exception. If you were a Roman soldier and you deserted, joined the enemy, and they got you back, you were going to be scourged viciously. And the scourging of Christ, made this comment the other night, and I'll pretty much stick by it. The scourging you saw in the Passion of the Christ was, without much doubt, much closer to reality than anything you see in all the artwork we'll talk about. That was, and there are notations and records from that period about how particularly harsh the scourging of Christ was. This was at least the third, if not the fourth assault that he sustained already. We talked about the walking already. He's sleepless. We have no indication he had anything to eat or drink since the Last Supper, since the supper the night before. Likely naked at the scourging, and more likely tied in this kind of position, hands upright. And the scourging involved the trunk, not the head and neck, but the trunk and the legs, trunk, buttocks, and legs. There were a variety of implements used for scourging. The ones that were not used, this would be the minor league type of devices. A virga was just a stick, a branch off of a tree with some thickness to it. Had a little bit of flexibility. And then if you add to that virga some cords that have a blunt end, and then they would take big feathers, like big peacock feathers, eagle feathers that had a bigger quill on the end of it. They would cut off the quills and tie them to the end. So you had the combination of blunt force trauma with the blunt ends of the cord and sharp quills that would cut into the skin. Not very often used in our terminology today would be called a Spanish cord. It would be a cord, a handle with several leather straps. But for Christ, most likely it was the flagrum. The flagrum was diabolically designed and diabolically effective. This is a diagram of what it would look like here. Tied to the post, you've got one person here, just like in the movie, the way it's depicted. And usually this flagrum had 3 or 4 leather cords that were about 1.5 to 2 feet long. And they would have lead balls tied to them. And then interspersed between the lead balls would be very sharp objects. It could be bone, it could be glass, it could be rock, something sharp. And what would happen, the lead balls would contuse the soft tissue, the skin, the subcutaneous tissue, the muscle. And not to make light of it, but this was a very evil meat tenderizer, because if the lead balls, the contusions soften the tissues, and the sharp objects would then be better, more easily cut the soft tissues. So it was centuries of improvement, which led to the Romans' real military precision about this. They had a protocol. There were 4 soldiers, the quaterno of 4 soldiers that would do the scourging. And a centurion that was their boss, the exactor mortis, the administrator of death, the exactor mortis. He was in charge of this entire affair. And the scourging was done by the lictors, usually 2, alternating back and forth, occasionally 1 that would change his position, one side to the other, or go up or go in different directions, but usually 2 for more efficiency. And unfortunately, this is where the precision drops off. If one of the lictors or both of them is having a bad day, if he just doesn't like something the victim said, the severity of the scourging more or less was at their discretion, or the centurions, the exactor mortis's discretion. And if you remember in the gospel passages, and you see it well in the movie as well, that wait, they stopped him. That's, you've done too much. We don't want this guy to die here. So they had to rein him in that instance. Now the Jews had scourging, but in Jewish law, you had 1 less than 40, 39 lashes. That was the tradition. you would get 13 to the chest area and 13 to each shoulder. So 39 lashes total. But clearly this was not a Jewish scourging. What the Romans wanted to do, they wanted to weaken their victim to almost a collapse, if not near death. And in the scourging of Jesus, the amount of trauma incurred, it would have happened outside the palace. The Romans their public relations campaign was very important to them. If they've got somebody making trouble, they not only want to make them pay, they want to make an example of them. So everything that's going to take place in regards to punishment is going to be in full public view. And from a Roman perspective, what better time to do it than a high holy day? You've got 250,000 of Jews from around the known world that are right there watching the Romans, the power of the empire. And this is where the Greek texts will particularly point to the scourging of Jesus. And if you go back to the shroud, in the analysis of the shroud, almost 10 times more scourge marks on the body on the shroud than what Jewish law would have allowed. So we're looking at a vicious and should be fatal amount of trauma. And if you take a look at if you accept the shroud and you look at the surface area of all these open wounds, if you add that up, assuming however long the scourging took, that amount of open wound, anybody would have lost at least 40% of their blood volume. Now, I can guarantee you, if you come in here, I don't care what your blood count is, if right now, over a period of a half hour to an hour, we drop your blood count by 40%, when you stand up, you are going to know it. You're going to be lightheaded, you're going to feel thirsty, your heart rate's going to go up, your blood pressure is going to drop. This is what we call hypovolemia, low volume, low blood volume. And those are the first indications of hypovolemic shock. The crowning with thorns really was a bunch of soldiers alone with Jesus, and they could have their way with him. And we all know about the mocking and putting the robe on and then crowning him in a very sadistic, satirical way. He's given a small wooden staff in his hand because royalty carries a staff. Well, you're the king of the Jews. You need a royal staff. Complete satire. But once the crown's on his head, they take the staff away and they hit him with it. And very often in the Caravaggio images and others, the thorns on the crown are so large, so sharp, they use these little wooden forks to push it on his head. And if you've ever had a cut in your head, around the face, bump your head, you get up under the cabinets and whack yourself. Is it sensitive? Yes, it's extremely painful. If you've had that laceration, I cut myself shaving. I don't get woozy, but there is a tremendous blood supply here. And the temporal arteries, you put your fingers at your temple right there, you feel the pulse. This is a very vascular area. So a lot of bleeding from that as well. Well, what was the crown made of? It's more likely it wasn't the ring crown. It was probably helmet-shaped. And it was made, the name for the plant now, in the modern era, the scientific name is the Ziziphus spina Christi. And it's a plant with a vine that has 1-inch thorns on it. And it probably was helmet-shaped. It would be like putting barbed wire on somebody's head. Razor wire. Now, if we go back to the Old Testament, the symbolism of the robe and the crown. And I think this is a point of good emphasis. The robe it is in the Gospels as a scarlet robe. A scarlet robe that probably came from a Roman officer. Scarlet is the equivalent of sin in the Old Testament. Taking on sin by putting on the scarlet robe. And the very first mention of thorns in the Bible is in the book of Genesis, right after the fall. Thorns and thistles under your feet. So thorns have the symbolism here as well. So after all this, he's taken back to Pilate. And like this look on Pilate's face here, washing his hands on the far right. you still get the sense that he's got to find a way out of this. Is he going to get a riot if he has Jesus killed? Is he going to get a riot if he doesn't have Jesus killed? Well, ultimately, he releases Barabbas. That doesn't help. And then, you know the story. Washes his hands. Basically, I'm not responsible for this. I don't think that Pilate was a Old Testament scholar, but the passage in Deuteronomy that hand washing is symbolic of I'm not responsible for this problem in that particular chapter. So Jesus carries the cross after that. This would have been sometime after 9 a.m. I put the cross in quotes, and that'll be clear in just a moment. The question about whether or not Jesus was clothed or not, Jewish custom would require him to have clothing on even if he was going to be punished. We don't know the answer to that. But Jesus and the two thieves, and tradition holds that Dismas, the good thief, Gestus or Justus, depending on your pronunciation, the bad thief. But these names come from the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is quite a few centuries after this all took place. And the cross itself, the most common depiction is what you see here, the T-shaped cross. My opinion, and it's an increasingly more common opinion, more likely carrying the crossbeam. And we'll come to the logic behind that in just a moment. There are two characters in this whole event that I will make a personal statement about because they just really capture my imagination, my heart. First is Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene is a village on the Mediterranean coast of current-day Libya. And Simon is, we assume he's a devout Jew, because why would he be in Jerusalem on Passover? Maybe he's a businessman. It says in the Gospels he was there on business. Well, is his business religion? Is it business for business? Is it both? We don't know that for sure. Well, here he is in Jerusalem, and he's here on the street, and here comes this guy that he doesn't even look like a man. He's been scourged, he's bleeding, he's unrecognizable, and Simon is picked out of the crowd to help him carry his cross. The trip from Cyrene to Jerusalem by land is about 1,100 miles. So whether he walked or whether he cameled or we don't know if he came by boat across the Mediterranean. We don't know, but 1,100 miles from Cyrene to Jerusalem. That's not the important thing here. If you go to the Acts of the Apostles, you find Simon in the Acts, and it talks about Simon and one or two of his sons became devout Christians after this. And they went back to North Africa and became very important in establishing the church there. And I maintain that the 1,100 miles was not as important as the 600 yards from the fortress to Golgotha. And we know that Simon did not pick up the cross until Jesus was on his way. So that short distance that Simon helped carry the cross was much more important than the exceptionally long distance. And this would be like us going to Jacksonville, Florida, or going to Albuquerque, about 1,100 miles. Going that far, but realize after you've done this, you become a Christian, you realize that short little walk was much more important than that long walk. What did Christ carry? The illustration from the article I showed you earlier, this is what is felt to be more likely. The crossbeam is called the patibulum. And the patibulum was usually strapped to the arms like you see here. Now, we know from the Stations of the Cross, he falls 3 times. What's breaking your fall? You've got this on your back and you go forward. If you fall forward, you know you're hitting your face. And if you go to the shroud, the bruising on the face is more significant. And the entire cross weighed more than 300 pounds, but the patibulum somewhere average about 100 pounds. Still, your blood loss, you've dropped about half your blood volume. Now you're going to carry 100 pounds strapped to your back. You've got open wounds on your back, and every time you move, those open wounds are being irritated or reopened by this rough wood that's on your back. So Jesus makes it to the site of the crucifixion, And Mark reports that he was given wine mixed with myrrh. There's a little bit of a disagreement here because Matthew says it was wine mixed with gall. Now, if you go back to the information from the foods and the drink that they had at that point in time, it's tough to figure out which is which. However, both were felt to be somewhat of a mild analgesic. And if you take that, again, another benefit of the doubt, was there one person there that said, here, drink this. It'll be better if you do? Maybe, could be. Was it another mockery? Was it somebody saying, yeah, we'll give him some wine, it's not going to make a difference. But we do know that he tasted it and he didn't drink it. It hit his mouth, but he didn't swallow. So, now the crucifixion itself. Those of you familiar with the real estate in Jerusalem now, what's known as the Holy Sepulchre, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is built over the site of Golgotha and what is felt to be the tomb of Christ. And we're pretty close. Our spelling for Golgotha, G-O-L, in the Aramaic, it is Golgotha, which is Aramaic for skull. And the Latin was Calvaria, the Calvarium, the head, because that outcropping of rock where the crucifixion took place from a distance looked like a skull, looked like the top of a head. So that's where those terms came from. And again, in true Roman fashion, the crucifixion outside the city gates, near a big, busy intersection, so to speak. It would be as if you put the crucifixion at 53rd and Brady, or the biggest, busiest place. Everybody will see it. People coming into Jerusalem for the Passover will see it. It's going to be the talk of the town. That's what the Romans want. They don't want this to be quiet. And in the history of crucifixion, this had been available as a punishment for about a century or more. King Darius of the Persians, there are records of the Persians being proud that they would crucify up to 1,000 enemy soldiers a day. So it became it was a point, not only a point of punishment and execution, but it was considered to be humiliating. To be crucified was the height of humiliation. Well, who comes over and takes care of the Persians but Alexander the Great? He and his army out of Macedonia, northern Greece, conquered the known world around the Mediterranean crescent. And Alexander the Great finds crucifixion. And he takes it along with him as a punishment into North Africa, Egypt and Carthage. And ultimately, Alexander starts to fall, and the Romans take over. And the Romans learned it from the Carthaginians, and they took it from there. They perfected it. They learned their scourging from the Etruscans. They learned their crucifixions from the Carthaginians, well, from the Persians by way of the Carthaginians. And it was meant to be maximal suffering, prolonging death as long as possible. And if you were in this category, you had it worse. And there has been one archaeological find of a crucifixion victim, one. And the story is in the Six-Day War in 1967, after the war was over, the next year, there was a bomb crater in northern Israel, and a bunch of archaeologists said, hey, could we just take a look, see what there is? And they end up at this small settlement called Givat HaMivtar, and as they excavate, they find an ossuary, a box of bones, that belonged to, the name on the box is Jehohanan ben Hagkol, the son of Hagkol. Would have been a young Jewish man. It would have been a contemporary about the same time of Christ. And what was found, this is a makeup of what it looks like if you were to reassemble it. This is the calcaneus, the heel bone. And this is an iron nail that goes through the outside, out the inside, and just here it was a small fragment of olive wood. So it would have looked like this. And it indicates that the heels were nailed to the sides of the upright, the stipes, what we call the stipes, the upright, the post. So 1 foot to one side, 1 foot to the other side. And the olive wood was there. The heels were nailed to the side, but there were no, looking at the hands, the wrists, the arms, no nails anywhere else, only in the heels, so probably tied by the arms. And the Romans talked about crucifixions. Now Seneca, you're familiar with Seneca, he was a writer, philosopher, politician from back then. I see crosses there made in many different ways. Head down to the ground, impaled on their private parts, others stretched out their arms. Many others, Plutarch and Livy, even in the non-Roman literature, the Jewish Talmud talks about crucifixions and how vicious and how diabolical they were. The question about Jesus being crucified naked remains unanswered. It is probably irrelevant. Most authors think it's probably true that he was, but again, did the soldiers defer to Jewish tradition with a loincloth? But we know what happened. If he had any clothes, he had to have something, because it's documented that his garments were divided when they cast lots. And the other topic is, okay, what did the cross look like? There are two kinds of crosses most commonly used at that time, 1st century AD in Palestine. The Tau cross, I think, is more likely. The Tau, think of it as a capital T. Now, the Hebrew alphabet, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Tau. And if you go back to the first Passover, when the sign of the cross comes from the original letter, that letter Tau, T-A-U. Back then it was, well, the Hebrew symbols, but you'll often find it spelled as T-A-W or T-A-V in some of the older manuscripts, but Tau, or the Crux Commissa. What is most commonly seen as a representation of the crucifixion is the Latin cross, or the Crux Immissa, which is the lowercase t. I'll come back with the patibulum, make a case for why I think it was most likely a Tau. Whether it was one or the other, we know it is meant to accomplish what the ends are. The means is not as important. A variety of different crosses that are used. It's relatively well documented that the Romans preferred the Tau cross at that time in that part of the world. However, it depended on what you got available. If you're in the desert, you don't have wood. The executioners had to make do. Sometimes it was what's called the infelix lignum, the wretched tree, or the unfortunate tree. If you didn't have time or you didn't have the materials, you just nailed them to a tree. And you hear that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's outlined in Deuteronomy as a tree was used for crucifixion. There are some religious denominations that talk about the crux simplex, which is a crucifixion on a single post or stake. The majority of them, majority of faith communities that believe that have a strong emphasis on their Jewish heritage. Some of the Jehovah's Witnesses sects. There's a small community in Southern California, a few places around the country, called Hope of Israel Ministries. And they maintain that Christ was crucified on a single stake. But the basic anatomy of the cross probably was this. You have the stipes, which was about 7 feet tall, with a smaller peg carved in the top, the patibulum that the victim would carry, with a slot in the center to fit over that part sticking up. And the stipes was relatively permanent. It wasn't so much, the sliding of the stipes into a hole. It probably was reusable. And the patibulum would be secured by that peg and hole. And occasionally you'll see this in artwork, a sedile or sedulum. And that would be right under the hips, more or less a seat. And that was used to prolong the process. We don't have any indication that that was used for Christ. And what was even more uncommon in Christ's time, and what we see quite commonly in artwork and in our own churches, is the supedanium. And that is the foot plate with the feet resting on top of something. And that probably was not commonly used. And no, of course, we don't have any indication that this was used in Christ's crucifixion either. And finally, the coup de grace would be the titulus crucis. the plate, the name of the victim, and the description of the crime. Who is it, and why are we doing this to him? So Jesus is thrown on his back. He's untied. If you take my theory, he's untied from the patibulum. He's thrown on his back on the ground, and his hands, wrists are nailed to the cross. What you see at the bottom down here, nailing the feet, maybe, but I think it's more likely that it was started with the wrist and the hands. And I mention wrist because it's almost necessary to nail what we call the wrist, not the hands. And you know this as well as I. Any crucifix you look at, any painting you look at, almost always, with rare exception, you find the nails in the middle of the palm, right? Okay. The nails are about 5 to 7 inches long. They're about almost a ½ inch thick at the head of the nail. But the ancients in their anatomy considered everything from where I'm holding my arm out to my fingers, that was the hand. What we call the wrist, they called the hand. So the hand went up to about here. And in cadaver studies, even in the 19th century, if you take a normal body weight cadaver, put nails in the palms, like we characteristically see, and hang that body, it won't hold. The nails go right between the metacarpal bones, the bones at the base of the fingers. There's not enough to hold it there. So they almost for sure, the nails had to be placed into the wrist. Now, what we call the radiocarpal joint, that would be right about there, what you see here. Those of you who have had carpal tunnel syndrome or carpal tunnel surgery, the median nerve is the nerve that goes particularly these 3 digits. If you've had that, imagine having a 7-inch iron nail through your median nerve. The pain, the muscle cramps would have been excruciating. Or it may have been, there is a French radiologist from the late 19th, early 20th century named Destot, D-E-S-T-O-T. And the space of Destot is just a little bit beyond and over here. And there are 8 carpal bones in the wrist. The 4 of them on this side, if you go right in the center of those 4, the ligament strength in that area, just like in the other part I talked about, is strong enough to hold that weight. So somewhere in this zone, not in the middle of the palm. And we know from the Old Testament, not a bone will be broken. Whether or not there were any dislocations, well, you can get a nail through these structures without injuring a bone. Between the 4 bones, the carpal bones, and the space of Destot, if you get the tip of that bone, it's hard to pound a nail this size through a healthy man's bone. That's why we use power tools in the operating room in orthopedics. You can't do it, so you have to find somewhere to go between the bones. All right, he's nailed to the patibulum in this position. Nothing done with the feet yet. And instead of what you see in the illustration here, taking the cross and bringing it up so it slides into the hole, if it's a lower cross, it would take about 4 soldiers that would essentially take the patibulum and press it up overhead to get it up over the stipe, so it goes up through the patibulum. If it's a higher cross, they would end up using ladders, like you see in the illustration, and they had, remember the wooden forks we saw for the crown of thorns? They would have much longer ones that they would push it up. They'd have people on ladders guiding it, and they would lift it up by that. It would take more work to do that. And throughout this whole thing, not only is he being mocked and taunted by the Roman soldiers, but now we know the Jewish leaders are out there as well. So the diaphragm can't do that. Ultimately, your carbon dioxide level in your blood goes up, muscles start to cramp, your heart rate starts going up as well. If you're not getting enough oxygen, your heart rate increases to try to make up the difference. When you hear somebody use the word excruciating, to say that what Christ went through was excruciating, that's an understatement. But think about the Latin word excruciatus. Excruciatus was specifically a word used that means out of the cross. So when you stub your toe and you describe it as excruciating, think twice about that. It hurts a lot. Excruciating out of the cross. All right, we get down towards the final chapter of this 18 hours. The 7 last words, more accurately phrases, but classically known as the 7 last words. Now this is where you put yourself at the foot of the cross and you think, what'd he say? You're not going to get a 7-minute sermon. It's going to be short. It's going to be hard to hear. This is a man who's trying to get what he needs to say out. So it's going to be very painful, very difficult to speak, very difficult to hear. Number 1, as difficult as it is, this is the first thing he says. That's a lesson in itself right there. Number 2, he looks to Dismas and tells him, you're good. I got you today. Number 3, he starts his church. Here's your mother. John, this is your mother. This is your son. Number 4, Elahi, Elahi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? He says this in Aramaic, and if you go through the entire all of the Gospels, this is really the only time that Jesus does not address God as his Father. He talks about him like everybody else talks about God. So this is that forsakenness, that abandonment kind of feeling. However, Jesus knows he's not abandoned, but he knows he's got these Jews around him, and they know Isaiah. And they know the passage from Isaiah that relates to this. Number 5, I thirst. He's offered a drink called Posca. And Posca was like a bottom barrel wine, vinegar. It was common with the peasants, the Roman soldiers. It was not top shelf type stuff. And what is more important than what he was offered is what it was offered on. It was placed on a hyssop stalk. And if you go back to Exodus, the very first Passover, the blood of the lamb to protect the firstborn in Egypt is painted on the doorposts with the lamb's blood, with a hyssop stalk. So the continuity is there. Number 6, it is finished. In the Greek transcriptions, the early Greek Bible, the word is tetelestai. Tetelestai means paid in full in the Greek. There are fines of papyrus receipts. You pay your taxes, you pay your bill, whoever you're giving the money to, they give you a piece of papyrus. You paid it, it says tetelestai. It doesn't say I died for you, it says I paid for you. Tetelestai means it is finished. It is not Christ saying I am finished. It is finished because he's paying the debt. And number 7, into your hands I commend my spirit. Now, a fine point that probably is not that important. Did he die and his soul then left his body? Did his soul leave his body and then he died? It doesn't, we know how the story goes. You know, I think that's too fine of a point to but at the point of his death, his last statement was this. And then the 3 ore, the 3 hours. The 3 hours after that, from noon to 3 p.m. From noon to 3 p.m., whether it's an eclipse, whatever, it's darkness over the land. And the average temp at high noon in early April in Jerusalem is going to be about 70 degrees. It's dark now, no sun. So it's going to be as cold as it was the night before, probably, in 3 hours' time, dropping into the 50s. But more importantly, in the Old Testament, the symbol of God's judgment is darkness during the daytime hours. Jesus' side is pierced. And this was not just a one-off. Roman infantrymen were trained. They had these lances that were 5-6 feet long with a big long blade on them. And they were trained to aim for what we would call the fifth intercostal space, between the fifth and sixth rib, right at about nipple level. And that spear was to enter at some point along this area, and we'll come back to the shroud in a minute. You aim for that area. The fifth intercostal space is here. This is the heart, the right side of the heart, left side of the heart. On the right side of the heart, if you come in there, you think, well, you might miss it. It might be too low. He's on a cross. You go the fifth you're going to go right up through the right ventricle and probably the right atrium, as well as, if you're far enough out to the side, come through the base of the right lung as well. And it's described in John's Gospel that there went out blood and water. And it is not because they didn't come out in that order. In Greek terminology, the Greek translation, it means prominence. What was the most is said first. So more blood than water. So blood from the right side of the heart, and the fluid that came out that looked like water, the pericardial fluid around the heart, the pleural fluid around the lungs. And the other character in this whole event that I want to mention besides Simon, St. Longinus. Longinus was a veteran centurion, and he was given the task of piercing Christ's side, even though he was dead already by all accounts. Longinus had had a long career, and he was almost blind. He was able to carry out minimal duties and said, hey, you know, this guy's not a big problem. Why would you go do this? Well, if you've seen the paintings and in the movie, in The Passion, he's nearly blind, but the blood and water falls in his eyes. Immediately his vision's restored. He converts, he follows the apostles after the crucifixion. He ends up becoming a monk in Cappadocia in southeastern Turkey. He is such a popular and tenacious preacher that the pagan rulers there take him into custody. First thing they do is they knock out his teeth. He goes back to preaching, they bring him back in, they cut out his tongue. And he ends up dying a martyr's death. And traditionally, the story is that a portion of his lance, when you look at the Bernini altar at St. Peter's, the spiraled columns, that a portion of his lance is inside one of those columns. And the last act before Christ is taken down that doesn't happen to him but happens to the two thieves, what's known as Crucifixion, or in the Greek, skelicopia. Break the legs to hasten their death. Was not required, and it fulfills the Old Testament. Not a bone will be broken. So after Jesus' death, he's taken down from the cross. The earthquake. An earthquake that's not a terribly earthquake-prone part of the world. That was the first indication something magic had happened, something unusual had happened. And I think something to a take-home point that I think is historically important. The temple veil was torn in half, and it's specifically mentioned in the Gospels. It's torn from top to bottom. If you're there in the temple and you're tearing it to make things look interesting, it's 60 feet up. You have to start at the bottom to tear it up. You're not going to get up there to do it. When Herod Antipas became Tetrarch of Judea, the veil was about 40 feet tall. And he said, no, I'm in charge now. We're going big. So he had it made 60 feet tall. But in spite of that, from top to bottom is how the veil was torn. And it was customary to leave the corpse out. There were animals that scavenged at nighttime, the bodies that were left out there. You had to have permission from the Roman authorities. And I mentioned Nicodemus, who said, wait a minute, he hasn't even been able to defend himself. Joseph of Arimathea, also in the Sanhedrin. Can you imagine, you have your own tomb. You're not going to tell Pilate that you know what Christ was up to, but you go to him anyway and say, I want the body. That's courage. That guy had guts. I mean, he knew it. So he wanted to protect the body. And the Jews, it is a violation of Jewish tradition to have a body out on the Sabbath. And Sabbath starts at sunset. So ultimately, the body's taken down. Christ is wrapped in a linen shroud. He's taken to the tomb of Joseph, which fulfills the prophecy in Isaiah as well.